Okay, we'll get started. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a good lunch. It's my pleasure to introduce our next session, and it's on a topic that I think is of keen interest to all of us. I try to follow it very closely, but there's so many moving parts. That's where this module makes a lot of sense to me. On the litigation, on kind of where we are with the Saudis, Taliban assets that have been frozen and unfrozen and thawed, and I don't know what they are. So we're going to learn about that. So we have the experts here today. Robert Haefele from Motley Rice is going to serve as our moderator. John Eubanks from Motley Rice, Jim Kreindler from Kreindler and Kreindler. And for those golfers out there that have watched some of the protesting that's been going on the LIV Tour, and of course being funded by the Saudis, and Terry Strada, who lost her husband Tom on 9/11, national chair of the 9/11 Families United, and as a golf fanatic myself, I appreciate what you've been doing to push on that system. So I guess for there, we'll turn it over to you, Robert, to one other thing. We have the app that we've been using for questions. That app is no longer available today, so as we get to a Q&A session, if you raise your hand, if we have time, we'll take those questions. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you all for coming. We thank you very much for your interest. And as Frank indicated, my name is Robert Haefele. I'm one of the co-liaison counsel for the Wrongful Death and Personal Injury Plaintiffs Executive Committee in the 9/11 litigation known as In Re Terrorist Attacks on September 11, 2001, or MDL 1570. That's the update that we're about to hear about. And I want to stop for a minute and just thank very much and express my appreciation to Voices for inviting us back. We appreciate the fact that we get the opportunity to come and make sure folks know what's going on in litigation. Frank has already indicated up on the panel with me, on my far left is Jim Kreindler, who along with my Motley Rice colleagues, Jody Flowers and Don Migliori, is one of the three co-chairs of the Plaintiffs Executive Committee for the Wrongful Death and Personal Injury Plaintiffs. And I have John Eubanks, who is also from Motley Rice, and he is, at least in my opinion, one of the foremost experts, as I know him, on the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund, so he's going to answer questions for us today about that. And then, of course, we have Terry Strada, who's the national chair of the organization known as 9/11 Families United, and she's going to talk about that organization's activities over the past year. I think we have a presentation, and I'm learning as I go on how to move forward on this. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about what the, and this is not moving forward.
The green arrow. Green arrow, green button.
All right. So we have, this is just a quick update on the status of the expert discovery. Last year when we were here at the conference last year, we talked about that the expert discovery in the charity portion of the case was essentially completed. The reports were served, all the depositions had been done, and what we had left was in November of last year, right after we were here, we had done what's called Dalbert Motions, which is motions to strike and limit expert testimony in the case. And so the plaintiffs, our side, had moved as to 4 of the 17 experts that the defendants had, and the defendants moved to address 2 of the 6 experts that the plaintiffs had. So basically, each side moved to try and limit the other side's expert testimony. Those motions are still pending in the court, and the court's considering them. On the kingdom's part of the case, where we were last year was we had finished fact discovery. In April of this year, we started doing the expert discovery in the kingdom portion of the case. The plaintiff served 7 expert reports. The kingdom served 3 expert reports, and all the depositions as to the experts was done in mid-July. So where does that leave us now? Well, for the charity portion of the case, We're waiting for the court to rule on the expert discovery issues. And for the Kingdom portion of the case, what we've done is in June, we submitted competing proposals for discovery. For what the next steps will be and what the schedule will be for that. And we're waiting for the court. Just recently, the court's on an inquiry on that issue. The court said, in due course, I'll tell you what my decision is going to be. But when those proposals went out, they went out with from the plaintiffs with a very strong caveat where we asked the court to consider a Rule 54B motion that the plaintiffs filed back in January. And I'm sorry, it was in December of 2021. What a Rule 54B motion is we asked the court to reconsider a portion of the court's decision from March of 2018, which was the decision that started this whole jurisdictional process with the Kingdom. We asked the court to consider some recent appellate court decisions that basically set the standard for considering how the court's supposed to look at material support in the context of terrorism cases. And the idea being, in a nutshell, the court's not supposed to consider each item of discovery or each item that a fact that's put before the court. It's supposed to look at all of those facts collectively and in a wholesale fashion as opposed to piecemeal. And if the court rules in our favor on that, then what could happen is it affects the schedule dramatically, because what could happen is it'll revisit that motion, or it'll revisit the portion of that decision that caused us to focus on only the events that happened in San Diego with regard to Bayoumi and Thamari and the support networks around them, and look more broadly at the arguments that the plaintiffs made and the storylines the plaintiffs set out related to the jurisdictional issue. And what could happen is it could leapfrog us over all of the jurisdictional issues the court's looking at right now and fast forward us to wholesale merits discovery in the litigation. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that the court will go with us on that and can then fast forward the case past the jurisdictional issues. The next item that we have on there is Dubai Islamic Bank. We haven't heard much about DIB, but some newly released FBI and CIA documents that came out as part of the Executive Order 14040 process that started last year, which I'll talk about in a minute, showed that DIB was for a long time a financial conduit to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And once we received that new evidence, we updated our discovery responses regarding DIB, and we went out and asked an expert to do a supplemental report on the additional information. We submitted that report. Of course, DIB was not happy that we submitted the report and promptly moved to strike that report. We've opposed that, and that's under consideration. I think there's a reply brief due next week. DIB also moved to dismiss. We opposed, and that brief is coming due soon, too. And finally, another motion related to DIB was just filed this past Wednesday. For years, DIB has expressed to us that they have no information regarding any relationship between the bank and al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, and they had no bank accounts for any of these folks. And the information from the Executive Order 14040 disclosures from the government indicated that's just not true. And we said that your discovery was completely not complete. And we asked the court to demand that they update their discovery responses to acknowledge the additional information. And that is a motion that's pending as well. So we talked about, something that Frank mentioned, the Taliban or the Afghanistan bank assets is an issue that came up starting in February of this past year when President Biden signed another executive order, 14064. And as part of President Biden's, that executive order, President Biden asked the court to address whether $3.5 billion of assets that were sitting in the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank are available to satisfy judgments against the Taliban. And recognizing that there was a number of folks that had claims against the Taliban and some folks that had judgments, and that set off a bit of a firestorm between different plaintiffs groups as to what to do about those competing claims for the assets. Well, that 2 weeks ago got changed in some sense, because 2 weeks ago the magistrate judge in litigation issued an order that said that the assets are not available to address any judgments against the Taliban, and that's a decision that will be under review by the district court judge. That decision will go up to the district court judge for the district court judge to reconsider it. And I think they have, the folks that have the judgments against the Taliban have until October 11th now to respond to that and to explain to the district court judge why the district court judge should not adopt the magistrate judge's decision. So with a little bit rest of the time, what I want to do, really quickly, there are some outstanding motions. We talked about the Rule 54B motion. We talked about the Dalbert motions, that's the expert motions to strike in the charity cases. We talked about the DIB motion. There's another motion that's pending related to Sudan. There was a favorable recommendation and ruling from the magistrate judge in May that was by and large favorable to all the plaintiffs. There was a small piece of that focused purely on some claims, not all claims, but some claims in the Burnett case, where the judge had a mistaken notion of fact related to whether or not the Burnett plaintiffs added new plaintiffs to the case when a consolidated amended complaint against Sudan was filed. That didn't happen, and the judge was mistaken on that, and so we brought that back to the judge's attention, and that reconsideration motion is pending as well. And then finally, there's an outstanding sanctions motion regarding to a breach of the court's two protective orders based on an investigator that released some information to a journalist, and that's a motion that's outstanding as well. So what I want to do with the rest of the time that I have is run through some of the documents that were released in the executive order process, the 14040 process. When we were here last year, you may remember that we discussed the Bipartisan Transparency Act that was introduced in Congress in August of 2021, which then became the genesis for the President Biden's executive order 14040, which is what was used to jumpstart the mandatory declassification review process of the United States government's investigations into the September 11th attacks. You might remember that while we were speaking, there was some discussion and some dialogue related to us waiting for the DOJ to reach out to us and let us know that some documents were being uploaded. Well, that didn't happen that day, but the very next day, actually the next night, we did get, the lawyers in litigation got notice that that process had started, and there was at least one document that was uploaded, and they were going to, as the EO 14040 process advanced, they would, in different tranches of productions, continue to produce documents, and you can find them on a website that's vault.fbi.gov. vault.fbi.gov, and if you go to that website and you search, there's a little search bar there, you can search for the term 14040 or 14040, and you can find all the documents that the government produced pursuant to 14040. And then in a series of productions that happened from September 11th last year through until early April of 2022, the FBI disclosed about 5,000 pages of documents in redacted form, but they did release a lot of information, very much information that hadn't been released previously. And on March 29th and April 1 of this year, the government produced another about 864 pages from CIA that were additional information. That's where that DIB information came, but it wasn't just DIB, it was a bunch of other information as well, and 864 pages of documents pursuant to the EO 14040 process. In addition to releasing the documents publicly, the government also released lesser redacted versions of those same documents to the lawyers in the litigation subject to protective order in the litigation. So we've gotten some of the stuff that's redacted from the documents for privacy purposes, we were able to gain access to. We just can't share it with the public. And what I want to do is look at some of the publicly released versions of the documents today. At Voices 2 years ago, in 2020, we were here talking about a 2012 report of the U.S. government's investigations into the attacks on 9/11. And there was in that 2012 report, it identified 3 individuals, Bayoumi, Thumari, and Al-Jarrah. And at the end of that report, it said that Fahad al-Thumari, Omar al-Bayoumi, and Musaid al-Jarrah provided or directed others to provide the 9/11 hijackers, Hazmi and Midar, with assistance in daily activities, including procuring living quarters, financial assistance, and assistance in obtaining flight lessons and driver's licenses. That report also said that Al-Jarrah, there was evidence that Al-Jarrah had tasked Thumari and Bayoumi with assisting the hijackers. And at the Voices in last year, one of the FBI reports that we're up here waiting for, the one document that got produced on the 11th the next day, was a declassified version of a 2016 FBI report, again about the government's investigation into the 9/11 attacks, and in particular into the Saudi government's relationship to those attacks. The 2016 report, one of the things that's important about the 2016 report is it tells us that despite the fact that the kingdom has for years relied upon one phraseology, one section of the 9/11 Commission report in 2004 to say that they have been exonerated, nonetheless, as of at least 2016, when this report came out, the FBI continued to investigate that very subject. And we also see that in the 2016 report that there are at least 8 Saudi officials, and I'm not saying there's all, but there are at least 8 Saudi officials who are flagged as, who are implicated by the FBI in the 2016 report as being a support network or involved with the support network for the 2 Saudi hijackers that came in through San Diego. And a number of these officials all had diplomatic credentials, and so many of them were part of are affiliated with the Kingdom's Ministry of Islamic Affairs, which is, the Kingdom has admitted, has a problem of radicalization during the relevant time period. And just over a year ago, in July of 2021, the FBI generated a 131-page compendium of information that the FBI titled Connections to the Attacks on September 11, 2001. And the purpose of this communication, the FBI says, is to consolidate information related to the involvement of personnel and entities controlled by the Saudi Arabian government, the Embassy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and affiliates within the United States with the attacks of September 11th. And it goes on to say that this document only discusses entities that are part of or closely tied to the Saudi Arabian government. On the next page of the document, it continues saying, although I don't know if you can read it that well, but on the next page, the FBI says an additional purpose is to document investigations and supporting documentation regarding the Saudi Wahhabi Salafi militant network that was created, funded, directed, and supported by the Kingdom and its affiliated organizations and diplomatic personnel within the United States. As Saudi government officials and intelligence officers were directly operating and supporting the entities involved with this network, their involvement with the activities of these organizations and individuals would logically be supposed to have the knowledge or concurrence of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia government. Now, let's take a moment to consider the executive order documents and see what they have to say about the 3 Saudi officials flagged in the 2012 and the 2016 report. Just 3 of them. I'm not going through all 8 of those, but if we look at just Bayoumi, Thumeri, and Jara and see what just a few of the executive order documents have to say. Bayoumi was a long-term employee of the Saudi government and one of the 3 main subjects flagged in the 2012 report. And the 2016 report elaborated on that some by saying that he had given assistance to the hijackers, including translation, travel assistance, lodging, and financing. Before looking at the compendium document, the 2021 document, I want to direct your attention to one other document from the EO collection, which is a July 14th, 2017 FBI electronic communication. And this is what it tells us about Bayoumi. In late 1990s, up until September 11, 2001, Bayoumi was paid a monthly stipend as a co-optee of the Saudi General Intelligence Presidency, or GIP, via then-Ambassador Prince Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud. Allegations of Bayoumi's involvement with the Saudi intelligence were not confirmed at the time of the 9/11 Commission report in 2004. The above information confirms these allegations. So as late as mid-2017, the FBI was identifying Bayoumi as having worked with Saudi GIP, which is roughly equivalent to our CIA. And he was doing that since the 1990s, straight through until 9/11, and answering to the ambassador to the U.S. from the kingdom, Prince Bandar, who's a member of the royal family. But nothing about that information was available in 2004, so it didn't go to the 9/11 Commission. With that in mind, let's look and see what the compendium has to say additionally about Bayoumi. It tells us that from January 2000 through May 2000, 2 known cellular telephones associated with Bayoumi showed roughly 100 calls to the embassy, the consulate in LA, and the cultural mission. So within that short time period, 100 times he's calling these Saudi government offices. And Omar Bayoumi was directly involved with the day-to-day support of the hijackers, Hazmi and Midar. And Bayoumi was known to be paid by a Saudi-affiliated company as a ghost employee while he was in the U.S. So here's what we know about Bayoumi so far. He was an agent for Saudi intelligence who worked for Bandar, a Saudi prince and a member of the royal family, and the ambassador to the U.S. He came to the U.S. under the pretense of a ghost job. He never worked. That ghost job was tied to the Saudi government. And in the months before the 9/11 attacks, 2 of his cell phones showed up to 100 phone calls to the embassy, the consul in L.A., and the cultural mission. And he was directly involved in the day-to-day support of at least 2 of the arriving hijackers. Next, we have Mr. Thumeri, who's another one of the officials that was identified in the 2012 report. Here's some of the things that the compendium has to say about him. Thumeri was a Saudi Arabian diplomat assigned to the Embassy of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as the Saudi Arabian consulate in Los Angeles. Al-Thumeri was a representative of the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and FBI queries about Thumeri after 9/11 were interest to the highest levels of the Saudi government. On the bottom left-hand side, this one says the requests for information about Al-Thumeri were of special interest. They went to the special attention of His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who then later on became the king. And he had regular contact with Bayoumi, who had regular contact with the hijackers. Another thing we know about Hazmi and Midar is that they were present in the planning meeting in Kuala Lumpur in December of 1999. That's in Malaysia, and they were told to go there for a summit, an Al-Qaeda summit in 1999. Both Hazmi and Midar were known to Saudi and U.S. intelligence agents as being Al-Qaeda members. Now, what we know about that summit is that at the end of 1999, and this comes from an FBI investigative report in October 2007, where they're debriefing a confidential human source that tells the FBI that in the end of 1999, the King Fahd Mosque received a phone call from an individual in Malaysia According to the caller, he wanted to speak to Al-Thumairy, and the phone call was regarding the imminent arrival of two brothers who needed their assistance. Those two brothers were, according to the confidential human source, Hazmi and Midar, the 9/11 hijackers. Now, here's the summary we have for Thumairy. Thumairy was a Saudi diplomat assigned to the Saudi embassy in D.C. and its consulate in L.A. He was a representative of the kingdom's Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and post 9/11 inquiries about him went all the way up to the top of the kingdom's government. Thumairy was in regular contact with Bayoumi, and one source to the FBI reported knowledge of Thumairy telling him to anticipate arrival of Hazmi and Midar, the two early arriving hijackers, and that call originated in Malaysia, where Hazmi and Midar were attending an al-Qaeda summit. The next one we have is Masaid al-Jarrah, who's another one of the main subjects of the 2012 report. Masaid al-Jarrah, this is what information from that July 23 communication from the FBI. The FBI says that Masaid al-Jarrah was one of the known GIP officers in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs section, so which is roughly, again, the equivalent of the CIA. That he's an intelligence agent in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. Here we see the FBI acknowledging that the Ministry of Islamic Affairs and al-Jarrah in particular were involved with the support network of the 9/11 hijackers, as well as the creation, funding, direction, and support of the extensive Salafi proselytizing network that extended throughout the U.S. He was a Saudi diplomat assigned to the embassy of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and was a high-level employee in the Islamic Affairs Office. He was heavily involved with the movement and support of the Saudi Salafi network within the U.S., including those members of the 9/11 support network in Southern California. Al-Jarrah had numerous contacts with terrorist subjects throughout the U.S., and he was closely associated with Prince Bandar. Al-Jarrah had a controlling, guiding, and directing influence on all aspects of the Sunni extremist activity in Southern California, which is where the hijackers were. So the summary for Jarrah: he was a Saudi diplomat at the embassy in D.C. He was a known Saudi intelligence officer. He was a high-level employee of the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. He had a controlling, guiding, directing influence. I mean, you see this on the screen. I'm not going to take the time to go through it, but essentially every single one of these folks had high-level positions within the Saudi government, and they were involved in the network, or they were involved with the hijackers directly, and they were involved with each other. What I want to do is jump quickly to address some of the documents that we have regarding the Dubai Islamic Bank out of the collection as well. If you remember, what I said about DIB is for years they told us that they had absolutely no connection with al-Qaeda, they had no connection with bin Laden, and they had no accounts for bin Laden or al-Qaeda members. Well, we have an intelligence report that came out of the EO collection that is a CIA intelligence report labeled Funding Islamic Extremists, Extremist Movements, the Role of the Islamic Financial Institutions. And one of the assessments from the CIA there is that Dubai Islamic Bank is a key financial conduit for Osama bin Laden's Islamic Army, which is another phrase for al-Qaeda. Again, Dubai Islamic Bank is a financial conduit for Osama bin Laden's Islamic Army, later on in a section that's focused on DIB. And again, in a top secret document, says the same thing, that they were a key financial conduit for al-Qaeda and for bin Laden's companies in Sudan. And they say, in that same document, Dubai Islamic Bank stands out because of their management's apparently witting involvement in the financial activities of al-Qaeda. Bin Laden and his Sudan-based companies maintain several accounts at DIB. Not only do they have accounts at DIB, but the Luta was a good friend of bin Laden. Bin Laden's Sudan-based companies, his financial officers opened bank accounts and letters of credit at DIB with the active help of DIB's chairman, Saeed Ahmed Luta. And Luta personally authorized, he personally stamped, personally signed the letters of credit that opened those letters of credit for DIB. through DIB, and LUTA is the one who authorized, stamps, and signs those documents. So both the Kingdom and DIB have argued for years that there's absolutely no evidence that they had any involvement or any role in supporting al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. For almost 2 decades, the Kingdom has recited over and again the same single passage from the 2004 9/11 report claiming that they were exonerated by the report, which, by the way, the commissioners have disavowed. They said that that's not what they meant by that. And if you read the passage immediately before and immediately after the one they rely on, it says something different. But consider, just for a moment, the items that we looked at today. Just consider that the FBI continued to investigate this issue years after the 9/11 Commission report. For almost more than a decade. Just consider that the documents we looked at flagged multiple Saudi officials as playing a role in supporting and engaging in the network that supported the 9/11 hijackers. The FBI's 2020 compendium framed this in this way last year. There is evidence of, quote, involvement of personnel and entities controlled by the Saudi Arabian government with the attacks of September 11, 2001. That was the assessment that happened in July of this past year, in 2021. And similarly so for DIB. It has long denied that it had accounts, and yet the CIA documents tell a different story. The defendants are going to parse through this again and again and again, and they're going to try and come up with some alternative universe of how these facts should be looked at. But when you put all of the evidence together, it paints a picture. And if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it sounds like a duck, it's a duck. If we look at all these proofs collectively, and don't do the mental gymnastics that it takes to parse out and try and argue that they had nothing to do with 9/11, the picture does become clear, and there is evidence. And I think it's what's our job is to put that together, put that evidence together, paint the picture, and show it to whoever's going to be the judge or jury in this, and make sure that it's clear that there is liability. So that's the update. That's a little comment on the EO documents. Thank you for listening. Jim, did you want to make some comments?
Sure. Should I come over here?
You can do whatever you want.
All right. I'll come over here.
What's that?
You can either, whatever you want to do, Stacy.
So, okay. So, with you all a year ago, I thought we were at a positive point in the case. Today, a year later, we are much closer to the finish line. As I see it, we've had 3 phases. It took 15 years to convince Congress to let us sue Saudi Arabia. It took 5 years to unlock our own government's documents on what the Saudi officials did. And now we're in the final phase when people in Congress, in the media, in the public, and the White House come to understand the reality that Saudi Arabia did it. When congressmen, senators, the president, State Department knows that Saudi Arabia is responsible, we're going to win. And in my opinion, that's where we are now because of the documents that Bob walked you through. For the 3 people I talk to most in Congress, Kirsten Gillibrand, Dick Blumenthal, and Jerry Nadler, reflect this understanding. For 15 years, we're with you, you've got a right to sue. For 5 years, you've got a right to see what our government determined. And then when we got to spring and summer and got the final July 2021 report, this makes clear that it's not just us screaming in the wilderness. It is our government verifying what we've been saying with far more detail than we had years ago. So I am very encouraged. I think we're at a point now where for sure we will defeat the Saudi motion to dismiss the case, we will win the case. And when that knowledge gets to MBS, that maybe you can kick the can down the road a little further, but Saudi Arabia is going to lose and is going to have to compensate the 9/11 victims, that gives us an earlier opportunity to resolve the case, which is something that every one of us in the room and watching on the screen would love to see happen. 21 years is a very, very long time. Now, I believe, this is my impression, that what Bob was talking to you about, 12 Saudi officials working intimately with al-Qaeda in the United States for more than 2 years before the attack, was something largely unknown to people in government, from Joe Biden on down. Now they know. I mean, remember, these documents were released publicly. We have additional information, not yet public. But clearly, when these documents were released, there are internal reports going right up to the Resolute desk. So I believe our leaders now know what Saudi Arabia did. And it's my belief that now that Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan have all spoken to and met with MBS, that we're on the many-item agenda between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The Live Golf Tournament events, and Terry, I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit, has been great for getting public attention to our cause. I mean, we all know the world loves celebrities and sports stars, and when Will Smith smacks someone, that's all the world's talking about. Well, the fact that we entered the sports entertainment world probably multiplied our exposure many, many times over. So I think that has been a great development for us in letting people understand that Saudi Arabia has gotten away with mass murder for 21 years. And, whether they in the abstract, none of us are concerned with a golf tournament. What we are concerned about is justice from Saudi Arabia. After there's justice, they can tee off wherever they want, but not until there's justice. And that's what you all are fighting for, and this event has been enormously helpful. There's two other things I want to mention to you. Bob was talking about our expert reports, and our expert reports, I think, total almost 1,000 pages. The longest report is the report of Bassem Youssef, who was a top FBI agent, first Arab-speaking FBI agent. He mentored Ali Soufran. Bassem was FBI legate in Saudi Arabia. And his report, the longest one, addresses the significance of all these phone calls in the eyes of the FBI. I mean, how does the FBI put together criminal cases, whether it's the mafia or anybody else? Rarely do you have the mafia chieftain saying, yeah, I ordered the hit. What you have is, when events are occurring, a whole series of phone calls, and when the events stop, those phone calls dry up, and a flurry of phone calls. And Bassem explains how all these phone calls with Jara, Thumeri, Bayoumi, and the others coincide with the arrival of Hazmi and Midhar and moving them around the country. Now, our expert reports, you all know I hate what I've been calling the gag orders and what are officially called the confidentiality orders, the protective orders. I can't wait until you know every word of every document. but our FBI reports refer to this information, so we haven't been able to give you, our clients, your expert reports. Now, we've been working with DOJ and explaining that if there's an item that's marked confidential, we've got public sourcing from it. And we've actually made a lot of headway. The Justice Department has now gone through, I think, 5 or 6 of the expert reports and said, okay, these are cleared to be released to the families. And we're mostly waiting to work through Bossam's report. But when we can send to you 1,000 pages detailing why the Saudis were involved, Emil, who was a CIA agent and lived in the Mideast and knows them, explaining why lying to Westerners is permissible, while an oath doesn't matter. You know, all of this stuff you're entitled to see, and I hope we are close to getting clearance to release Bassem Youssef's report, the most factually detailed report. And when all of you have 1,000 pages that lay out why Saudi officials were involved, what they did, who did it, how they did it, that is going to be enormously important. And it gets me back to the first thing I had to say. When senators, congressmen, president, State Department knows for sure that Saudi Arabia did it, we're gonna win. And when you all know that, they're going to know it. You know that you are 50,000 voices. Just one other word for me. You know, Bob talked about, and some of you have asked me about this Afghan bank issue, and here's my take on it. Joe Biden tried to play Solomon. There's $7 billion of Afghan bank money sitting around, so that half to Afghan refugees, half to the court. You figure out, you know, how to get it to victims. And it's not just 9/11, it's embassy bombings, military families. There's lots of other terror cases against Iran. Well, 2 things happened. One, when we got Zawahiri, finally, you know, then we woke up. This government in Afghanistan, the Taliban, is harboring the head of al-Qaeda. So President Biden said, no way am I releasing $3.5 billion to refugees or people who are harboring al-Qaeda. That part is rescinded. And then the court did what's probably not a surprise to any of us, said, we can deal with different groups fighting over $3.5 million for the next 5 years. But if we decide none of you are going to get it, we're done with the case. And that's what Netburn did. And you all know, for all these years, there hasn't been one time when Judge Daniels overturned what Judge Netburn has done. So now we've got a prospect, probably. We'll appeal, we'll keep fighting for it, but probably you have $7 billion sitting in a vault, gathering dust for 50 years or 100 years until Afghanistan throws off the Taliban. That's nuts. So in this situation, there should be legislation or an executive order saying, look, you can't. If this money is used to cure cancer, save Ukraine, wipe out COVID, great. But not to have $7 billion sitting in a vault for 50 years. This is nuts. So what are we going to do with the money? There's only one thing that can be done with the money. 2.7 goes to catch-up, 5.3 goes to all the terror claims, half is 9/11, half are other claims. So we're all working on finding some logical, practical situation to uncork $7 billion that's just sitting around gathering dust. So I am hoping that next year, when we're all together again, we're all together, celebrating the resolution of all these issues. That would be wonderful. And we are in a situation where no one can predict what happens and when. But we are so much further than we've ever been, with far more public support and calling for logical and right solutions, that, I believe ultimately the right thing's going to happen, and I hope it happens before next year, and we're all here having a drink and saying so long. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. And with that, what I'd like to do is ask if Terry Strada could stand up and say a few words about what the activities of the 9/11 Families United organization has done this past year. And then we're going to finish off with Mr. Eubanks, who I think we're going to roll right into a Q&A session with John. And obviously, it doesn't have to be limited to USV SST issues, but John's going to roll us into the Q&A. Terry?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Terry Strada. I lost my husband on September 11th, and I've been advocating for the family since 2002. It has been an honor to do it, and it continues to be an honor representing you with Congress and with the media. Years ago, when this organization started, we didn't know where and what we were going to have to do, but we have fought hard to get the 28 pages declassified, to get JASTA passed, and to get the executive order last year from the president, which I think is where we were last year, talking about all the documents that we've heard about today and how important that effort was. We've created a website. It's called the 9/11familiesunited.org. There is a lot of good information on this website. The documents are there. The important documents are there. All of our press releases are there. Interviews that we've done are there. And all the information that the organization does, which is basically, like I said, just advocate for all of you and my family as well. We also did have to get involved this year with the Live Tour, and when that came about, we quickly wrote a letter to Phil Mickelson and a couple of the other golfers, really a pretty scathing letter to him about trying to get him to realize what he was doing by taking hundreds of millions of dollars from the kingdom for a sports washing entity, because when you pay everybody up front, you are doing away with any competition. And like it was said, it's not about the golf, it's about the entity, and it's about the kingdom trying to put on this front that they are a legitimate, government, when they still have never owned up to what they did on September 11th, and thank God we are getting so much closer to exposing that truth. So you'll see a lot on the website, too, about what we did as far as Live was concerned. You can sign up on this website. You can join us. You can give us just your name and your email address. And if we have a call to action this year, which we might have to do another one, which usually entails your signatures on letters, then we can reach out to you and you can be part of it. You can also let me know if you'd like to be more involved. I would welcome anybody that would like to participate more in what we do, which are the interviews and giving the quotes when something newsworthy happens. I did an op-ed just the other day that was through the USA Today, Northern Jersey publication, and it's great. They allowed us to just give a couple of the documents and talk about how important it is, like everybody here is saying, that everybody learns that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is responsible for murdering our loved ones and injuring all of the survivors. What the Live Golf Tour did bring a part or recognition up, and I had family members out in Indiana. Now, they've always known what happened, but my cousin is a teacher, and she said some of the kids must have seen something on TV, and they said, what are they talking about, Saudi Arabia involved in 9/11? And she said, yeah, absolutely. Anybody should go to the website. They can read about it. They can learn about it. So that was the good thing about Live. But does it move the needle? I don't know. What moves the needle are these documents. What moves the needles are our very talented lawyers here. And what moves the needle are our work together when we have to go to Congress and we have to go to the White House and we have to insist that they cooperate with us. Congress has always been great. Administration's not so much. State Department usually not at all. But we are making tremendous progress, and I am, like I said, honored to always represent you and continue doing what I can to bring all of this for our loved ones, right? Tomorrow's going to be a very hard day for all of us. I think when there's so much unfinished business, Mary wrote a fabulous op-ed. It really described everything that's going on with us so perfectly, that how are we supposed to put this to rest? How are we supposed to, when there's so much unfinished business with Guantanamo Bay and with our lawsuit? We need this conclusion. We need to close this chapter of our lives. We're never going to have what we lost. It's never going to be over for us, but we need the peace that I think this conclusion to this lawsuit will bring all of us. At least it will close a chapter, an important one. And we need to set the record straight for the history books. I don't believe we have the right way or the correct way of teaching 9/11 yet in the classroom. I don't think we're doing justice at all to the younger generation. So look out for that, because that might be what I get involved in next. Thank you very much.
It's hard to follow that group of people speaking, especially when I'm somewhat changing the topic. But first of all, I want to thank the Voices Center for allowing me to come and present to you again on the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. So we've been talking about the Saudi portion of the case, the charity portion of the case, Taliban, and Live Golf. But what we haven't talked about is really Iran and the fund. Really, what is providing a source of compensation for a lot of our victims in the meantime while we work through these other issues. So I'm going to give a little bit of an update on what's going on with the fund. So in 2021, 2022, the special master of the fund, her name is Mary Patrice Brown, she determined that there would not be distributions in 2021 and 2022. This fund goes through 2039, but I know a lot of our clients were wondering, okay, that's 2 years down. What's going to happen now? So last month, or possibly in July, the special master announced that there would be a distribution in 2023. But then that was followed with, and the grand total amount of what we anticipate being distributed is roughly $85 million. Now, to put that into context, in the past distributions, each distribution has been in excess of $1 billion. So I'm here to be somewhat a bearer of bad news that the payments are not going to be high, but a bearer of good news in that there are going to be payments come next year for anyone who has a valid claim and eligible claim with the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. But to not get your hopes up that those payments are going to be significantly large. Now, that is the standard distribution for 2023. Now, I know that a few other people have discussed what is colloquially called the catch-up payment. So the catch-up payment, as many people know, when the law relating to the fund was changed in 2019, actually, no, in 2020. It was changed twice. And in 2020, when the law was changed, it empowered the Government Accountability Office to issue an audit of the fund. Because as many of you know, the 9/11 victims themselves, whose claims had gone through the VCF, their spouses and their dependent children had been left out of the fund for the first two rounds of the payments from the fund. So what this catch-up audit was intended to do was to determine how much it would cost to bring the people in those various categories, so the victims, their spouses, and dependent children, up to the same payment levels as others. In August of 2021, and I know I discussed this last year, there was a report issued by the GAO that said they anticipated that the payment would need to be approximately 5.8573% of your eligible judgment amount to qualify as a catch-up to put people on par with what other payments had been received by other family members who were found eligible in previous rounds. There is currently legislation that was introduced in August by, and I know a lot of people might be surprised by this, but a Republican in the House, which is a huge development. Having a Republican bring this legislation to authorize an appropriation of funds for the catch-up payment. So this happened earlier this year. Senator Menendez tried to put an amendment onto the budget bill to authorize and appropriate funds for the catch-up payment, but it did not make it into the final bill. Not many of those amendments that didn't have a whole lot of bipartisan support made it very far. Now, I know that there are efforts to try and get this catch-up payment tagged on to other bills in the coming months, whether that's the Defense Authorization Act, whether it's a budget, whether it's an omnibus budget bill. But right now, there's a standalone bill out there that could stand on its own and possibly allow those funds to be appropriated so that that payment could be made in 2023. Right now, we don't know. It's speculation, but it is something to keep an eye on for the coming year. Now, I know a lot of people have asked me, a lot of our clients in the Burnett litigation have asked me, how much money does the fund have? It's a tricky question. It's not tricky to know how much the fund has. It's a tricky question to know how much the fund has available to pay. A lot of people can look at Treasury website and see what the current balance on this fund is. The current balance is close to $250 million. So you wonder, why is there only $85 million being distributed? There are a number of factors that go into that. One is they try and keep a reserve. And I'm not trying to be, again, the bearer of bad news, just trying to give the information so that people have this at their disposal, is that they want to keep certain amounts of money in reserve for the operations of the fund, but also in case there is some other change coming down the pike. In addition, there are what are called conditional payments to people who are involved in other litigation that they may or may not get paid out of this fund, but their payments are being set aside while the other litigation winds its way through the courts. And that's over $100 million all by itself of conditional payments that are just sitting in the account that are going to continue to sit in the account until something happens in that kind of parallel litigation. So I know a lot of people look at what that balance is and say, well, it's a lot higher. Why aren't they distributing this larger amount? And that's really the rationale behind it, because they're distributing what they can and not put themselves in a hole. One of the issues with why the amount of money is so low, during COVID, and I know nobody wants to hear the excuse COVID, but during COVID it was very difficult to engage in enforcement actions against companies who were illegally doing business with Iran, Sudan, Syria, North Korea, Cuba. But that's how this fund is funded, is through these enforcement actions by the U.S. government. So the enforcement actions have been down. The amount of money in those enforcement actions has been down. And so, therefore, the pot of money that's available to be distributed is down. But I want to look on the bright side here. The special master, I think, I have not confirmed this, but I think that she desired to make a payment. She had gotten enough pressure over 2 years of saying, no, there's not enough money, no, there's not enough money, that it was time to make a payment, even if it was going to be small, just to show good faith to all of the eligible claimants. So while these numbers may be less than people are wanting or anticipating, keep in mind the rest of the litigation, as Jim and Bob and Terry have talked about. That's still going on. That's a separate entity from these payments from the fund. It's a separate entity from the Iran portion of the case. So let's keep an eye on the Saudi portion. Let's keep an eye on the Saudi charity portion, the Taliban portion, the Sudan portion. Iran is one element, and this fund is one element. But together, we're continuing to move this ball forward for all of us. it is an extreme honor to be able to represent this community of people. Even though I am with Motley Rice, so I'm on the Burnett case. We kind of divide into cases, but we're all under an umbrella. It's called the Plaintiffs' Executive Committee, as Bob was talking about earlier. So in essence, we all represent all of you, and it is an honor to do so. At this point, I want to open up for questions. You can ask any questions about anything anyone talked about today, or if something else is bugging you about the litigation or updates you've gotten from your attorneys. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yeah.
How many law firms in total? I've seen different law firms on the panel over the years, but how many law firms in total are involved with this?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, how many law firms in total are involved in the multi-district litigation, in the 9/11 litigation? It's a bit of a nuanced question solely because there are the firms who are involved in the executive committee who really kind of run the litigation. And then there's the bigger question of how many firms are involved who represent people but don't hold a leadership position. So I might kind of ask Bob if he can answer that question.
Sure. Thank you. Well, John's right that there is one question is, the lawyers who represent their own individual plaintiffs represent their own individual plaintiffs. There is a leadership committee that's broken out by the court that back when the litigation first started that created a two-part plaintiff executive committees, plural. There's one group of lawyers that are on the plaintiff's executive committee that represents business interests, and then there's another set of lawyers who are on a plaintiff's executive committee for the wrongful death and personal injury plaintiffs, and that's Jim and I are part of that, and John as well. So there's a hierarchy, not a hierarchy, that's probably the right word to say it, but there's a executive committee formalization that was created, and on the insurance company side or the business side, there's one law firm out of Philadelphia that represents those interests, Cozen O'Connor, and then on the wrongful death and personal injury side, there's a multiple co-chairs. Two from Motley Rice and that really hold one seat. So when I represented Don Migliori and Jody Flowers, they share one seat, and Jim holds the other seat on that committee as well. And then under that, there's some co-liaison counsel and then members of the committee. But basically the plaintiffs' executive committees together try and work together to try and do all the coordination for all the plaintiffs, whether it's the insurance companies or you. Now, when it comes to individual things that relate to specifically the wrongful death and personal injury plaintiffs, that's something that we take control of and we advocate for. And in any instance when there's an issue that relates to a particular plaintiff, that particular plaintiff's lawyers are going to, like when it came to putting together the actual judgments in the Iran cases for a particular set of plaintiffs, that fell to the particular firms that represented the particular plaintiffs. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Let me just add one thing. A real simple way to think about it is Motley Rice with the Burnett case with roughly a third, Kreindler and Kreindler with the Ashton case for roughly a third. And about 6 years ago, we all got together and said, why don't we collectively represent new cases, people who are joining the lawsuit later. And Jerry Goldman at Anderson Kill is doing the new cases. But Kreindler and Motley and Goldman are collectively doing that third, that's the new cases.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm a 9/11 first responder from day one, and
Thank you.
no, I'm glad to be here. I'm very grateful to be here, to be invited. Two things I want to say. I would love to see the United States government be reimbursed for every single nickel they had to lay out, and they're going to continue to lay out, just as a matter of principle. Number one, it's a comment. Number two, my other comment is, as far as puzzling and interesting politics and interpretations. I don't know if you all know this, anybody in the room, but the Leonardo da Vinci painting, the Salvator Mundi, was purchased by the Saudi prince through either Christie's or Sotheby's. There's 2 documentaries out. One's called The Lost Leonardo, and the other is called Savior for Sale. It's something that you really need to look at because it will justify what you're endeavoring to achieve. I really want the whole world to be aware of the Salvator Mundi and what it means to the whole world, and how the Saudis were allowed to purchase it. Now it's hidden in history. And I'm just saying is that here they purchased this, and then they don't want to do the right thing as far as owning up to what they did. I just want you to be aware of that. It's very important to understand about this painting.
Well, maybe Jim, we can put that
It's called the Salvator Mundi.
Yeah.
Well,
There's 2 documentaries I'll repeat it: The Lost Leonardo and Savior for Sale, and they're both fascinating.
we're going to try and get that back, right, Jim?
I'll write that down for you.
Yeah.
It's very
So,
fascinating.
and here's the point I think you're making. MBS can see a Russian oligarch's yacht and buy it on the condition he's off by lunch for, $1 billion, can buy the painting to have important Western icons in their possession. So what this tells me is our case is not like a simple car accident case, where it's how much money. Money, I don't think, is going to be the impediment to settling the case. It's when do the Saudis realize that they can't run anymore and can fit a resolution of 9/11 into all these other issues they want to achieve. So you brought up a good point. And the point is, they're willing to spend money. They're willing to pay golfers, $500 million when it suits their purpose. So to me, when that happy day comes, when we're across from a negotiating table, that's an important thing we're aware of that we're keeping in mind.
Well, I just want to highlight it because when you go to settle, or when you go to settle, keep that in mind that they've acquired something tremendously valuable to the whole planet. A 500-year-old painting that was lost and is found, and it's stunning. Then they go and they have this other psychology that they're implementing. It's not right, and of course it's mind-boggling, and it's not justice.
You're right. We get it.
I'm glad.
Thank you.
That's my point. I want you to get it. Thank you.
Thank you for your point. That was a good point.
Who was next here?
As we all know, classified documents were found at Mar-a-Lago, and given the Trump family's involvement with Saudi Arabia, do the excellent panelists have any reason to believe that some of the classified documents that are now in possession have anything to do with what we've talked about this afternoon?
Yeah.
I can tell you that I have no idea what was at Mar-a-Lago, so I have no idea whether, I have no reason to believe one way or the other.
Yeah. Bob is right. Obviously, we don't know what's there. But given everything from day one, President Trump, his first visit out of the country, this Saudi Arabia, the Golden Orb, the sword dance, Jared's $2 billion Saudi investment, my nose tells me there's a real chance that there is something of real interest to us. But we'll see.
Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Baznicki. I'm a Canadian 9/11 widow. And firstly, Terry Strada, I'd like to let you know that as much as you and your American friends and family members fought for the JASTA bill, I was the spearhead and the driving force behind the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act in Canada. Thank you. I appreciate greatly the support that I'm getting here in the United States from my fellow family members, and especially to Voices who are hosting us today. But I do find that I'm struggling, and John, you know this. I have to make this public because justice isn't just for Americans. There were 90 countries that were involved, and I find myself being tossed about between my country, Canada, and the United States. First of all, I had legal expenses to the tune of $180,000 because our lawyers were not cooperating or doing pro bono work, such as the American attorneys were doing down here. Secondly, in this suit, shall we say, I find that I'm troubled by the fact that a reply comes often to me, well, you're not entitled to this because you are not an American citizen. And I would venture to say that I'm entitled to justice too, and that this crime doesn't know borders, and that in the capability to sue, and I'm as far as my knowledge is concerned, I'm part of Kreindler. I'm not pronouncing it right.
Kreindler. That's all right.
Okay.
Part of the family says Kreindler, so
Okay.
you're allowed.
And Crosby. I was told by an American lawyer or a Canadian lawyer that I could be part of both. But most recently, another Canadian 9/11 widow received funds. We discussed this, John, briefly. And when I queried why she received funds and I did not, it's because they said it was a mistake. She was a Canadian. She wasn't entitled to this money. So it is with great apprehension and regret that I don't think the families feel this way, and I don't think justice should be confined just to the American courts, and that are you providing for cross-border victims?
Yeah, I can answer that, and if you don't mind telling you an old story. What started all this, the first Anti-Terrorism Act, was the 1996 effective death penalty and Anti-Terrorism Act pushed by the Pan Am 103 families so that they could sue Libya. The act applied to American victims. Of the 270 people who were killed in Pan Am 103, there was 189 Americans, and the rest were from other nationalities. I settled that case with Libya. When I was negotiating with the Libyans said, well, under the law, we only would be paying Americans. My answer is, do you, as a sovereign country, want to face the international community and say that Canadians, Argentinians, Brazilians, whoever, have no value? And even though Libya, under the 1996 effective death penalty Anti-Terrorism Act, was only liable to American victims, Libya chose to pay the same $10 million to all 270 victims. Here, as you point out, there are non-U.S. citizens, and obviously none of us can make a promise to you, but I can tell you personally, I'll push as hard as I can for the family of every person who was murdered to be treated equally, the same, fairly, wherever they were born or wherever they lived or whatever differences they have. I can't promise success, but I can tell you we will try.
Yeah, let me follow up on that real quick, what Jim said. I think, Maureen, I can tell you that all of us, I don't think there's a single lawyer that I know in the litigation that looks at one case as being, the life being less than any other person, whether it's a person in the United States or outside the United States. We are hamstrung, however, by what the law is. But I can tell you that we have fought very hard to keep claims in the case. Some of the laws, as you know, apply only to U.S. persons and not non-U.S. persons, and we're hamstrung by that. But we've fought very hard to keep claims in the case that allow claims to continue for folks who are not U.S. citizens. And I think that's what we're going to continue to do, and continue to make sure that the rights of non-U.S. citizens are considered exactly the same as best as we can. I'm not sure if do we have time for another one or not?
Bob, can I add one last thing to that question? And this pertains specifically to the litigation against Saudi Arabia, because and Maureen, you and I have discussed this. I don't want to kind of get into that. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, so as you all know, we are seeking jurisdiction over Saudi Arabia through JASTA. As opposed to the law that allows us to sue Iran, JASTA does not require United States citizenship or does not require a U.S. national for that sovereign immunity to be stripped against Saudi Arabia. JASTA allows us, regardless of nationality, because the attack happened in the United States, to be able to go after Saudi Arabia. And then if we get that jurisdiction, it either, for the Americans, that passes through to become an Anti-Terrorism Act case, more than likely. For the non-Americans, that likely becomes what is referred to as a common law wrongful death case, a common law cause of action, because it happened here. It didn't happen somewhere else. There's jurisdiction in the court here. If Saudi Arabia is treated like any other individual under the law, which is what happens if you strip them of sovereign immunity, then they are treated as if they got in a car accident here in the United States, and it doesn't matter what nationality you were. If you got hurt in that car accident, you can sue them here.
Can we take one more really quick question?
All right. Since the annual amount is available has been reduced, would the judgment still be being made and the distribution being made over a period of years now be?
I didn't understand. I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
All right. Now that the annual amount is reduced, would the judgment still continue to be made, but the distribution be distributed over a period of years?
This is relating to the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund.
Okay.
Let me make clear, the payments are reduced this year. So it is really dependent upon activities of our government, enforcement actions against entities, individuals who have illegally engaged in activities with a designated state sponsor of terrorism. So that's why in 1 year you've got a significant amount because somebody got dinged for a huge violation, and then this year there's a small amount because there were a lot of small payments, but not that big one that was that big fish on the hook, I guess. Yeah. And there are a few of those big fish that we see that just haven't come to that resolution yet, so that money hasn't come into the fund. So just because it's small this year doesn't mean the next distribution is going to be the same. The dollar figure is not determined by it's this amount this year, so that's what it's going to be next year. It's really determined by activities of the U.S. government and their ability to bring money into the fund.
All right. Before I close this out, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to turn it back over to Frank. But I know that there's some additional questions. We're out of time, but I know I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, and I don't know if John will be around, and I'm not sure about Jim or Terry. But if you all want to grab us outside, I'm happy to answer questions if you have any.
Well, Bob, thank you for narrating the session. I think we could go really for hours on this topic because it's so intriguing. I needed to thank Terry first because as a fellow family member, to see her determination over all these years, I'd like to give her a round of applause for it. And you gentlemen, we talk about continuity of care in the social work dimension. It sure is nice to see the continuity in the law side of it, and you guys are so expert on it. You're in their face, you're making a difference, and I hope, Jim, you're right that we're kind of at the goal line here of making a difference. But let's give them all a round of applause.
Right.